Watch this.
Idaho's GOP is bringing back the presidential caucus. Is it the best thing for the party or the worst when it comes to involving voters? There seems to be a lot of blame being thrown around. No shirt, no service. No government-issued ID, no voting. Another controversial decision from this past legislative session. But youth voting advocates are threatening legal action. And we're answering some viewer questions today, all about fire and fireworks. Because, well, 'tis the season.
The biased press are working overtime to share a disinformation campaign to deflect from the fact that the Secretary of State, legislature, and governor disenfranchised every Idaho voter.
Okay, so that is part of a video released yesterday by Idaho GOP Chairwoman Dorothy Moon, trying to combat all the pushback from the decision made at the party's general meeting last month about bringing back a Republican presidential caucus next year instead of a primary. The thing is, though, it isn't what she calls the biased press claiming they are disenfranchising voters. It's coming from inside the House, members of her own party.
A caucus then gives you the ability to once again control the decisions of hundreds of thousands of Republicans, and it's made by a smaller group. What we know from other states doing this is you have 10 to 15% participation rather than, over 50% participation when you have a primary.
So not only are members of her own party claiming this is true, it's also members of her own party who put themselves in this position. The majority party voting last session to eliminate the March election and move any presidential primary to May. And in the chairwoman's opinion, that takes Idaho out of any sort of valuable participation in picking a Republican president. Well, this seems like a good time to bring in chief political reporter Joe Paris to explain kind of how we got to this position.
Yes, and all of this goes back to the legislature, as so many things do, but yes, and this goes back to legislations that was actually passed earlier this year, and you may remember that lawmakers approved and the governor signed a new law that aimed to combine the March presidential primary election with the May state primary. And a technical error with the new law inadvertently eliminated the presidential primary altogether. So a trailer bill was whipped up to get things back on track at the end of the legislative session. However, it died an untimely death in the House State Affairs Committee. So it's up to the parties, Democrats, Republicans, to create their own nomination process. GOP Chair Dorothy Moon announced what Republicans are planning on doing, a firehouse caucus on March 2nd, 2024. That is, caucuses all around the state of Idaho. And a caucus, if you're unfamiliar, it involves people physically getting together in a group and separating into smaller groups based on candidate preference or undecided. From there, speeches, arguments, debates go down to convince people to pick a candidate, and the group with the most people, they win. And a lot of times this happens in like a high school gymnasium. It may not be the best option, but the GOP says it's their only one at this point, a blame that Chair Moon placed firmly on state leaders.
Idaho's Secretary of State introduced legislation to move Idaho's presidential primary from March to May. The bill he introduced and the legislature passed and the governor signed failed to include language that would move our presidential primary to May. Instead, removing the presidential primary completely.
So some context is needed here, and I mentioned that there was legislation that would have fixed everything to allow for a presidential primary in May. Well, Chair Moon testified against that in committee, saying that she had no input as party chair.
I represent the party of Idaho here in Idaho, and I'm very concerned that the primary stakeholder on this issue was never consulted. Now, I did speak to the Secretary of State on January 2nd at an Ada County meeting, and he was under the impression that I was supportive of it, and I said no. In fact, I was wanting to move the primary up into February so we could be the Iowa of the West.
The Secretary of State tells me, by the way, he spoke with Chair Moon several times after January, but anyways, that legislation died in a weird way. Watch the end of this meeting.
Senate Bill 1186 is properly before the committee. Senate Bill 1186 dies for a lack of a motion. Sorry. Already made my decision.
So it does happen, but if you've seen that happen, it is very rare. So what is this all about anyways? Well, Chair Moon says it's about making Idaho front and center of the presidential nomination process. They think a March caucus is better than waiting for a May primary if lawmakers allow that option.
Keeping the Idaho GOP's presidential nomination process in March will incentivize national candidates to campaign in Idaho, learn and debate issues important to Idaho, and appeal directly to the Idaho voters to advance the interest of our state, including our industries, job creators, and employers. The Idaho GOP must remain in the front of the presidential nominating process.
Voting is crucial, and having candidates visit Idaho would be great. The truth is, though, it is very unlikely for major presidential candidates from the GOP to visit Idaho for an extended amount of time. Maybe a quick fundraising stop like we've seen in the past. But with only a couple dozen delegates for the Republican convention, and candidates know their time is used better in other places, coming to Idaho, well, it's a decision you have to make. For perspective, though, on the change, primary to caucuses, I spoke with Boise State politics expert Dr. Stephanie Witt, and she highlighted the practical challenges of having a caucus. Maybe some of you have memories of the 2016 Democratic caucus downtown where there was a lot of chaos.
I think there's no question that this reduces turnout significantly. You have to be available on that evening and for a long time, and whether it's a work schedule or childcare, other things that get in the way of people being able to take that much time to come down and participate whittles the number of participants significantly.
For example, in 2012, only 1 in 10 Republicans in the state of Idaho even went to the caucus. Meanwhile, I spoke with Idaho Democratic Party, and they are calling on the Idaho legislature to reinstate the presidential primary election. And I've spoken with plenty of Republicans, too, and there are some calls for a special session later this year. But, Brian, the legislation, when it died in committee because of a lack of motion, it was a weird ending. But when you think back to that meeting as a whole, there's competing ideas. Of course, when you talk about having the May presidential primary, well, that's not what portion of the Republican Party wants. They want it even earlier in the year. Right. Dorothy Moon even mentioning she wanted it in February. So now you're going to have this battle between those that say, okay, we want to have this in May and we want to do it the primary way, or you have folks that are going to say, no, we have to do it earlier in the year for X, Y, and Z, but it has to be a caucus because of the way things are set up.
So bottom line is there was a mistake when trying to remove local school elections from March. There was a mistake in that bill. They had a chance to fix it. They didn't. Now we're going to say we're going to try to add a caucus, which limits the voters, because again, 1 in 10 is the history that shows up for these caucuses.
And the caucus and the primaries is very different. The caucus has an opportunity for conversations, exchanging of ideas, people being swayed. Primaries, you go in and vote, so you can make arguments for both sides. I do want to mention, I spoke with Secretary McGrain today over the phone, and he told me that his office, he and himself, they're pushing to have a primary. They really like the primary over the caucus. We will see, though, where this goes. Will there be a special session? We'll find out. I've heard, though, that lawmakers are ready to hit the ground running in January to come up with a solution.
They only have 3 months to do it. All right, thanks, Joe. Speaking of voting, have you registered? More than 987,000, I think, their names on Idaho's voting rolls. At least that's the latest count available from the Secretary of State's office. Tally might not surprise you. More than 570,000 of them are Republicans. 270,000, I should say, unaffiliated. 125,000 Democrats. If you're doing the math, there's a small percentage scattered, smaller parties and groups kind of out and about there, Constitution, Libertarian, you name it. You pick your affiliation when you do register, unless you're the unaffiliated type. Volunteers signing up voters, are common at public events and festivals, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of people soliciting with clipboards, either for a candidate, another group. There's one organization that is now setting those clipboards down. Youth Voting Advocacy Group, Babe Vote, says a new law is giving them all sorts of barriers. Here's Andrew Bartline.
Hitting up the voting booth? It's your way to get a say.
Right.
And Sam Sandmeyer says,
exactly.
It's time for young people to get in line, if they can.
Most of the Babe Vote volunteers are very young. Some are even too young to vote themselves, but they all care about their future, and they know how important having a voice in their future is.
Babe Vote is run by young people for young people with Sam's help. They gather the clipboards and help new voters register. At least,
so
they did.
It became a waste of Babe Vote volunteers' time to go out and have people fill out these cards and think they're registered.
Babe Vote blames new barriers on House Bill 340. The new law requires new voters to provide a proof of residency before they're officially registered to vote.
And when we would explain to them, now you have to provide proof of residency to your county clerk, people were just not ready to take that additional step.
Even though that additional step isn't new at all, Idaho voters have always been required to supply proof of residency before they registered. That includes an Idaho driver's license, bills, or a pay stub. But the Secretary of State's office says the voter cards on clipboards could be a loophole. People could register to vote on those cards without proving their address.
You used to be able to just fill out the number of your driver's license or the last 4 digits of your Social Security. And now you have to actually provide that proof.
It's proof that Babe Vote volunteers cannot verify on their own,
making it more difficult and for us really impossible to help people complete their voter registration is just not democratic.
Did you feel that there was a problem with the system before where people were registering to vote in Idaho who otherwise shouldn't be?
If you're talking about voter fraud, it is extremely rare. I believe that these 2 laws were a solution in search of a problem.
The second law removed student IDs from the list of acceptable identification at the voting booth. In tandem, Babe Vote tweeted they will immediately stop actively registering people to vote. And they say it's now time to file a lawsuit and ask a judge to put a pause on the new registration law.
I just think it's sad that groups that are focused and their mission is registering voters just missed huge opportunities over the 4th of July to register a lot of voters.
The Secretary of State's office says groups, including Babe Vote, can still fill out registration cards. However, that registration is not complete until you provide a proof of residency. And that can happen at the polls on Election Day. When you go to vote, you would bring your driver's license, a pay stub, a bank statement, whatever document that's approved that you have to prove your residency. So this is the part, Brian, where you ask me, Andrew, why'd you do this story today? Go ahead and ask me.
Okay, why'd you do this story today?
So that's my driver's license. The address is my old address. I just moved at a 4th of July parade.
Okay.
I filled out a card so I could have my new address down when I go to vote.
Right.
Well, I would have shown up. They would have asked for my driver's license. The addresses wouldn't have matched. I wouldn't have been able to vote that day unless I came back later with a form
With
of
another
ID.
form to prove that's where you live.
That exactly, which could have been a bank statement, whatever.
But that's kind of the way it is now anyway. If you show up, whether you filled out one of those cards or not, you still have to prove those things.
Yeah.
You are the person you are, and you live where you live.
Yeah, but if you already did it beforehand, you just need to show your ID. I need to prove my residency when I go to a different poll next time.
Okay, so this just kind of makes it, well, the same all around.
Secretary of State's office said they filled a loophole.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. All right, viewer question time's the part of the 208 that is the most interactive. I mean, other than the time when we take time at the end of the show to share the text messages you sent in during the show, there's still time to do that. These are still text messages, and the first one, well, isn't exactly a question, but more of a long-winded rant. I've lived in Boise for more than 15 years. I'm so sick and tired of the 4th of July in this ever-growing city. You get unregulated explosives and sell them to everyone, and then you add alcohol to reckless people, and you're going to have fires, and you're going to have injuries. And the 4th of July has been a nightmare for residents for years, and every year after the fact, we have to hear on the news about all the drama that is going on. Why in the world don't either the police department or the fire department or the public officials band together and pass a law to outlaw them? The only fireworks that should occur are those highly regulated ones in the parks. Maybe sometime instead of the police department and the fire department complaining about how busy they are, they need to do something about it and become the solution-oriented. It's so ridiculous, particularly to people who have to work the next day and at 2 a.m. There's still fireworks going off everywhere. Please forward this to the 208. Well, we got it. We got it. Thank you. And there's a lot to unpack there. But let's start in the middle, which I'm told is the best place to start a story. The 4th of July has been a nightmare for residents for years, and every year after the fact, we have to hear on the news about all the drama that is going on. Well, it's a July 5th standard in Boise newsrooms. Just how busy were police and fire departments on the 4th? For example, Boise Fire told us they responded to 117 emergency calls, 25 of them fire-related, a nearly 20% jump over 2022. Caldwell Fire went out to 17 fires between June 30th and July 5th, most fireworks related. Nampa Fire, 17 fires caused by fireworks on July 4th and into the early morning hours of July 5th. Which brings us to the unregulated explosives and selling them to everyone part of that text from somebody we don't know who it is. Forget for a moment the mixture of alcohol and the reckless people. Fireworks were actually regulated in Idaho 26 years ago with the Fireworks Act of 1997. It then deemed the only fireworks legal in Idaho not used in a permitted supervised public display are non-aerial fireworks. It says right in state code, ground spinners, fountains, sparklers, smoke devices, or snakes designed to remain on or near the ground and not to travel outside of 15-foot diameter or shoot out sparks or burning material that goes higher than 20 feet or in a 20-foot diameter. Doesn't include firecrackers or jumping jacks or stuff like that. So anything outside of that scope is illegal to shoot off in Idaho. However, you can buy them in Idaho. Anything outside of that scope. And if you do, you're required to sign an affidavit that says these fireworks shall be transported out of Idaho and discharged only in a place where such fireworks are permitted by local, state, and federal laws and regulations. Problem solved, right? I mean, nobody's going to sign something and not stick to it, right? As evidenced by this video from a Meridian neighborhood Tuesday night. Some pretty loud explosives. And you probably stand up at any high point across the valley and see it. This one from last year, 2022. Fireworks scattered all across the Treasure Valley from backyards and neighborhoods, not from publicly permitted sanctioned events. Finally, why in the world don't either the police department or the fire department or the public officials band together and pass a law to outlaw them? That's the question. Well, maybe sometime instead of the police department, the fire department complaining about how busy they are, they need to do something about it and become solution-oriented, says the text. Well, 6 years ago, they tried. Then Boise Fire Chief Dennis Doan was at the forefront of getting the selling and using aerial fireworks thing on the same page. In 2017, Representative Matt Erpelding from Boise tried to introduce a bill that made them both illegal, kind of meshed the two rules together. In February of that year, the second month of the legislative session, it was brought up in the House State Affairs Committee. But it didn't even get enough votes to get officially introduced as a bill. 6 in favor, 9 against. So there isn't even any public record of it happening. But we covered it then, and then Fire Chief Dennis Doan was beside himself.
Why do we have something illegal already, deemed by the Idaho State Legislature in state law that's illegal, but we're going to allow the sale? So we were trying to close that loophole.
Well, that loophole is still wide open, and there's a lot of people who like to point out what kind of seems like a racist kind of reasoning behind the 9 no votes.
Representative James Holtzclaw said he couldn't vote for it because the bill didn't apply to Native American reservations.
You would have one faction that would still be able to sell these, and no one else could. in my mind, I couldn't get past that. I just didn't feel like it was fair.
Are we going to continue this uneven playing field where the tribes are given exception because we have no jurisdiction over them, and we continue to regulate private parties to the disadvantage of private parties?
It's very short-sighted to say that because you could still sell them on the reservations, we should just allow them to be sold here.
So, see, anonymous texter, the fire department at least tried, and so did some lawmakers. But we're sorry you were kept awake by the sounds of fireworks on the 4th of July. I can only imagine what time you usually go to bed when you have to be at work at 2 a.m. But it's not like there aren't already rules in place, and those have tried to make them even stricter. By the way, there's not been another attempt to restrict the sale of aerial fireworks in Idaho since 2017. Okay, so they tried to pass that bill, and they believe they had the momentum to do that because of what happened the year before. On January 29, 2016, a Boise man launched a Roman candle near Table Rock, and it started a huge fire. It was hot, it was our 3rd straight day of triple-digit temperatures, and it was breezy. And within hours, the fire torched nearly 3,000 acres and burned down a 2-generation family home. Well, after months of investigation, then 19-year-old Taylor Kemp, who originally claimed he had nothing to do with it and was simply in the area and tried to help put the fire out, well, he was charged with the unlawful use of fireworks in September of 2016. Kemp was cited for a misdemeanor and was given a jail sentence of 6 months. He served 20 days. Kemp was also ordered to pay more than $400,000 in restitution. Well, yesterday, Jill in Boise, likely inspired by the fires from this year's 4th, asked, what is the update on the guy who was ordered to pay for the Table Rock fire? Well, Jill, in the 5 years since, Kemp has violated his probation, has moved back to his home state of Pennsylvania, and has only paid $1,700 of that $400,000 he owes. His last payment was a mailed check of $20 on August 5th of 2019. A bench warrant was issued for his arrest for contempt in November of that year, which is still active. And according to his Facebook page, which is something unto itself, he's an axe master at an axe throwing center. But he's still a long way from cleaving into that debt he owes the city of Boise. All right, welcome back to the final minute of the show. On the topic of primaries versus caucuses when it comes to the Republican, vote for president, Kathy says this: we should not have to declare a party affiliation. This limits my choices. My thinking is not totally along the line of any party. Kathy just wants to vote for the best candidate. When Idaho's GOP closed the Republican primary back in 2012, they disenfranchised independent voters. Thus, Idaho is not represented honestly or fairly as it stands now. This one: how can the Republicans hold a caucus in February when the legislation is still in session, asked Doug. Well, they would just do it themselves. They don't have to worry about what goes on in the legislature. They would just hold it then, just like they plan to do it on March 2nd, which is a Saturday of this year, regardless of what happens in the legislature. I guess when Chairwoman Moon speaks, her words carry weight, like when she blatantly lied about critical race theory being taught in Boise County schools. It's kind of the worry that what she says should be just taken as gospel. Well, that's our job to kind of, I guess, put that gospel to the test. We'll see you back here tomorrow.